He conquered Europe and sent it the bill. Napoleon Bonaparte is remembered as a military genius, the man who bent nations to his will through battlefield brilliance and sheer audacity. But here's what most people never learn. Napoleon's empire was not built on cannons alone. It was built on a financial system, one that turned conquest into cash flow, war into revenue, and defeated nations into involuntary treasuries. He didn't just beat armies, he invoiced them. And the system he constructed, extracting indemnities, stabilizing currency, centralizing banking, was as revolutionary as any campaign he ever fought. But like every empire built on extraction, the bill eventually came due. And when it didn't just bankrupt France, it rewired the financial architecture of Europe forever. Welcome to the financial system. Control the money, control the history. And remember, simple is never easy. To understand how Napoleon funded an empire, you first have to understand the wreckage he inherited. Because Napoleon didn't rise from strength, he rose from ruin. By the time he seized power in 1799, France had spent a decade destroying itself financially. The revolution of 1789 had toppled the monarchy, but it had also detonated the economy. The revolutionary government, desperate for cash, had confiscated church lands and issued a new paper currency called the assignat, backed by the value of those lands. At first, it seemed like genius. France was rich in land, but starved for liquidity. Paper money would circulate wealth, pay soldiers, and stabilize the new republic. But politicians did what politicians always do with a printing press. They couldn't stop. By 1793, the assignat had lost more than half its value. By 1795, over 45 billion livres in assignats had flooded the economy, and the currency was practically worthless. Farmers refused to sell grain for paper that evaporated in value overnight. Bread riots consumed the cities. Savings vanished. Soldiers went unpaid. The revolution had promised liberty, but when it came to money, it delivered hyperinflation and chaos. The assignats were abandoned, replaced by another paper currency, the mandats, which collapsed just as quickly. France lurched from one monetary failure to the next. This is the world Napoleon walked into, and he understood something that the revolutionaries never did. You cannot hold power without holding the currency. Military victories are temporary. Financial stability is what makes an empire last, or at least that was the theory. In 1799, Napoleon staged his coup and became First Consul. His first moves were not on the battlefield, they were on the balance sheet. In 1800, he founded the Bank of France, a centralized institution modeled partly on Britain's Bank of England, designed to restore confidence in French currency and credit. The Bank of France would manage the national debt, regulate the money supply, and issue banknotes backed not by seized land or revolutionary promises, but by metallic reserves and disciplined monetary policy. In 1803, he went further, introducing the franc germinal, a new currency unit tied to a fixed weight of gold and silver. For the first time in over a decade, France had money people could trust. The franc germinal would remain stable for over a century, outlasting Napoleon himself, outlasting revolutions, outlasting 2 world wars. It was arguably his most enduring achievement, and almost nobody talks about it. But here is where the story turns dark. Because stabilizing France's currency was only half the equation. Napoleon needed revenue, colossal, unrelenting revenue, to fund the most ambitious military machine Europe had ever seen. At peak mobilization, the Grande Armée fielded nearly 600,000 troops. Military expenditures reached an estimated 600 to 700 million francs annually. That is an astonishing sum for the early 19th century. France alone could not sustain it through taxes, and Napoleon, unlike Britain, could not rely on deep bond markets or generations of investor confidence. So he invented a different model. He made war pay for itself. Napoleon's financial innovation was brutally simple. Conquer a nation, then charge it for the privilege of losing. After every major victory, defeated powers were forced to pay massive indemnities, what were essentially invoices for their own subjugation. These were not symbolic gestures, they were calculated extractions designed to feed the French war machine. After the Treaty of Pressburg in 1805, Austria was forced to pay approximately 40 million francs. After the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, Prussia faced contributions estimated at around 120 million francs, a staggering sum that nearly destroyed the Prussian state. These payments were not optional. French troops occupied the territories until the money arrived. Delay meant extended occupation and further costs. Napoleon's marshals enforced collection with military precision. The conquered paid in gold, silver, grain, horses, and materials, whatever France needed. It was conquest as cash flow, war as invoice. And this is what made Napoleon's system different from Spain's plunder model or Rome's tribute system. Napoleon wasn't just looting, he was systematizing extraction. Each victory funded the next campaign, each indemnity replenished the treasury, each occupied territory became a revenue source that reduced the burden on French taxpayers. For a time, it worked brilliantly. French domestic taxes remained relatively moderate because Europe was paying the bill. Napoleon understood something that every empire eventually discovers. The cheapest way to fund power is to externalize the cost onto someone else. But extraction was only one pillar. The other was economic warfare. In 1806, Napoleon issued the Berlin Decree, launching the Continental System, a continent-wide trade embargo designed to strangle Britain economically. The logic was straightforward. Britain was Napoleon's most persistent enemy, the one power he could not defeat on land because its strength was rooted not in armies but in finance. Britain's economy depended on trade. Its navy dominated the seas. Its bond markets funded coalitions against France. If Napoleon could cut Britain off from European markets, he could suffocate its economy without firing a shot. On paper, the Continental System looked devastating. Every European nation under French influence, from Spain to the borders of Russia, was forbidden from trading with Britain. Ports were sealed. British goods were confiscated. Merchants caught smuggling faced severe punishment. It was the largest economic blockade the world had ever attempted. But reality was less cooperative than theory. The Continental System created enormous strain, not on Britain, but on Europe itself. European economies depended on British manufactured goods and colonial products like sugar, coffee, and cotton. Cutting off trade didn't just hurt British exporters, it starved European consumers and merchants. Prices for everyday goods skyrocketed. Smuggling became rampant. Entire networks of black market trade emerged along coastlines and borders, often with the tacit knowledge of local officials who were themselves suffering. Portugal refused to comply and was invaded. Russia eventually broke from the system, unable to absorb the economic damage any longer. Spain, already restless under French domination, erupted into a brutal guerrilla war that bled French resources for years. The Continental System, intended to cripple one enemy, ended up alienating half a continent. And it exposed a fatal flaw in Napoleon's entire financial model. An empire funded by extraction requires obedience. The moment vassal states resist, the moment the cost of compliance exceeds the cost of rebellion, the revenue stops flowing. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, Britain was fighting the financial war with an entirely different weapon: debt. While Napoleon extracted tribute from conquered nations, Britain borrowed from its own citizens and from international markets. The London bond market, built over a century of institutional trust since the founding of the Bank of England in 1694, allowed Britain to raise capital on a scale Napoleon could never match. During the Napoleonic Wars, Britain's national debt soared. By 1815, public debt exceeded 200% of GDP, a figure that sounds catastrophic by modern standards. But here's the crucial difference. Investors kept lending. They kept buying British government bonds because they believed Britain would honor its debts. That belief was not blind faith. It was backed by a functioning tax system, a growing industrial economy, global trade networks, and a parliament that, however imperfect, provided accountability for public finances. Britain didn't need to conquer nations to fund its wars. It needed to maintain trust. And trust, it turned out, was a more durable resource than any indemnity. This is the asymmetry that decided the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon's system required perpetual victory. Every campaign had to succeed because each new war was funded by the spoils of the last. One major defeat, one failed extraction, and the machine would stall. Britain's system, by contrast, could absorb defeats. It could lose battles, retreat, regroup, and borrow again, because its financial credibility survived setbacks that would have been fatal to a conquest-funded empire. Trafalgar secured the seas, but it was the London bond market that secured the war. The collapse came not from a single moment, but from the accumulation of costs that conquest could no longer cover. The invasion of Russia in 1812 was the turning point, not just militarily, but financially. Napoleon marched over 600,000 troops into Russia. The campaign consumed staggering resources. And when the Grande Armée was destroyed by winter, by distance, by scorched earth, it wasn't just soldiers that were lost. It was the entire economic model. There were no indemnities from Russia, no extraction, no captured treasuries, just catastrophic expenditure with zero financial return. For the first time, war had cost everything and delivered nothing. After Russia, the coalition wars accelerated. Napoleon still won battles, but each victory was more expensive and less profitable. The territories he had bled for revenue were now rising against him. Prussia rebuilt its army. Austria re-entered the war. Spain was a quagmire, and Britain kept funding every coalition with loans, subsidies, and gold, the financial oxygen that kept Europe's resistance alive. Between 1793 and 1815, Britain disbursed an estimated £65 million in subsidies to its continental allies. That money didn't come from mines or plunder. It came from bond markets. It came from institutional credit. It came from a financial system that could sustain prolonged conflict without conquest. When Napoleon finally fell in 1815, the financial reversal was absolute. The Congress of Vienna didn't just redraw the map, it presented France with the bill. After Waterloo, France was forced to pay 700 million francs in war reparations, plus the cost of occupying armies stationed on French soil. The very extraction model Napoleon had perfected was now turned against France. Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Britain demanded payment, with the same cold logic Napoleon had once applied to them. The empire that had invoiced Europe was now being invoiced in return. And this reversal reveals the deepest lesson of Napoleon's financial system. Extraction works until it doesn't. An empire that funds itself by bleeding others creates enemies who will eventually bleed it back. Spain learned this with its silver. Rome learned it with its debased currency. Napoleon learned it on the frozen roads of Russia and the fields of Waterloo. The financial model that powered his rise was the same model that guaranteed his fall. But here is what survived. The Napoleonic Wars didn't just end an empire, they transformed European finance permanently. Before Napoleon, wars were still partly funded by treasure, plunder, and feudal obligation. After Napoleon, the dominance of institutional credit was undeniable. Britain had proven that a nation with deep bond markets and investor confidence could outfight an empire built on military genius. The lesson reshaped how nations thought about power. Sovereignty was no longer just about armies, it was about creditworthiness. The ability to borrow reliably, cheaply, and at scale became the ultimate strategic advantage. The Rothschilds, who had financed British operations during the wars, emerged as the most powerful banking dynasty in Europe. Capital markets in London, Frankfurt, and Paris matured rapidly. Sovereign debt became the backbone of state power, a system we still live inside today. Every time a government issues bonds to fund a war, a stimulus, or a crisis, it is operating within the framework that the Napoleonic Wars made permanent. So what does this mean for you? It means that the pattern Napoleon embodied, externalizing costs, funding ambition through extraction, and mistaking military dominance for financial security, is not ancient history. It is the recurring logic of great power finance. When modern governments run deficits funded by foreign creditors, when empires project force while hollowing out their balance sheets, when wars are launched on borrowed money with the assumption that victory will cover the cost, they are playing Napoleon's game. And Napoleon lost. The lesson is not that conquest fails, it's that conquest-funded finance has an expiration date. Systems built on extraction collapse when the extraction stops. Systems built on institutional trust, on credible debt, on transparent governance, on economies that produce real value, survive longer. They are not immortal, but they outlast empires that mistake the battlefield for the balance sheet. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Napoleon conquered a continent and sent it the bill, and when the continent finally stopped paying, the empire vanished, but the financial system it forged endured. The question is whether we've learned the difference between power and solvency, because history suggests most empires never do. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. It's financial system, and history leaves clues. I show you where the money leads.